Hello, everybody. Yeah, welcome back. Yeah, I was kind of scrambling. Thing I did set up, like maybe you've seen a new overlay setup, and it's not everything's quite right yet, but I like it better. But I've still got some work to do on it. So, uh, yeah. Okay. So we are going to be starting in on an essay called The Myth of the Good Cop. This is part 4, and let me go ahead and drop the link for it out here. This is a continuation of the police and policing segment of the Abolition for the People series. And it's written by Mark Anthony Neal. He's a frequent contributor to NPR. He's a professor at Duke University on African American Studies. And he's written several books. One of them I linked in the Discord, which looks very interesting to me. What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture. I think especially for white people, black pop culture is vastly misunderstood. And this fellow does a lot of analysis of it, both going back through like the soul era as well as more modern pop, and even digs into black popular culture during like the civil rights era. So there's some good interpretations in some of these books, and I'm very curious to read about them. I've not yet read the books, but we're going to be reading one of his essays, so yeah. Let me go ahead and punch on over to it. That, at least, is working. The Myth of the Good Cop. As always, I'm going to be reading it, providing some commentary and discussion. Anyone, if you have thoughts at any time, feel free to interject, because this is intended to be a conversation. We're here to kind of try and promote learning and better understanding of issues we face today, as well as how they came to be and how they, issues that have existed for a very long time. So, can't do that in a bubble. Myth of the Good Cop. Pop culture helped turn police officers into rock stars and black folks into criminals, exploring how propaganda empowers law enforcement to terrorize with impunity. If you're of a certain age, the last of the boomers, or the first cohort of Generation X, and grew up black and urban, you may have a tendency to romanticize the cops who used to walk the beat. The boys in blue who knew everyone in the neighborhood. Truth be told, the officers I most remember from my years growing up in the South Bronx were white do-gooders who appeared on TV in the 1970s. Back then I was oblivious to the criminalization of black bodies, the anti-black violence that was propagated by the law enforcement community writ at large, or the ideological framing about who and what the police were. I was unaware of the propaganda that pop culture had served up to an unsuspecting public for generations. Propaganda The reproduction and circulation in mainstream media of propaganda that is favorable to law enforcement has long been a tool to disrupt legitimate claims of anti-black violence. Simply put, propaganda actively counters attempts to hold police malfeasance accountable by reinforcing the ideas that the police are generally fair and hardworking, and that criminals deserve the brutal treatment they receive. Such cultural framing has been critical to buttressing the need for a more expansive criminal justice system that fuels mass incarceration. So, opening premise. This is something that we talk about a lot, which is all the media framings of any interaction with police. It always favors the police. They write the report, they tell the story, and the criminal in media portrayals is always, portrayed just as a criminal who deserves to be shot, stabbed, what have you. Whatever happens, the story tends to be flipped in they were resisting arrest, they were doing something bad, and law enforcement, the good guy with the gun got him. And it's not just in media. He points out, and it's going to talk extensively about how this perception is something that exists in pretty much all of our media, in video games, in movies, especially in movies, in TV series, etc. Not in colleges. That may be true. Yeah, he's talking about media portrayals, though. So, yeah. When I was a kid, my father worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. He spent his downtime listening to gospel quartets and watching police and detective dramas that played in the NBC mystery movie programming rotation. Shows like Macmillan and Wife, McCloud, and Columbo. I suppose that my father, a black, undereducated working-class man from the South, was drawn to the kinds of folksy, down-home characters featured in these shows, in part because he found them to be comforting examples of respectability that would be available to his young son. The shows were often comical and pivoted on innocuous notions of morality, where good always won out over bad. The criminals were rarely evil on 1970s television in the ways that so-called Middle Eastern terrorists were portrayed in the 1980s. McCloud, for example, was a fish-out-of-water detective from the Southwest who brought his style of policing to the big city, where he'd often chase criminals on horseback. Columbo, which aired intermittently for more than 3 decades, hinged on the genius of a dusty, rumpled gumshoe who constantly looked as if he'd just fallen out of bed to solve a case. While those shows endeared law enforcement to the public, other programming from the era was more intentional in its messaging. Another staple on my dad's television was The FBI, a show that saw actor Elfrem Zimbalist Jr., a Goldwater Republican, acting out scripts vetted by the actual FBI, which in real life was laying waste to a generation of black freedom fighters and their organizations. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover architected COINTELPRO, which used various forms of disruption, including infiltration and violence, to undermine civil rights, anti-war, native, and white radical organizations. Hoover famously identified the Black Panther Party as the biggest threat to American society. The FBI was monumental in swaying the public at the time when law and order was a rallying cry. Okay, so I went through a few paragraphs there because he's kind of laying out the case and drawing examples of very innocuous and benign portrayals of law enforcement, where they generally affect a overall positive good, and especially the point about the show The FBI highlights that media portrayals are deliberate in trying to shape public perceptions. This really isn't, news per se. The idea that media is used to shape public opinion is just part of having a media. But where it gets kind of insidious and very, very problematic is where it is trying to elevate law enforcement actors above reproach by just creating and constantly reinforcing this image of them as always on the side of good and always actually protecting and serving. Admittedly, there are shows where there are corrupt cops, but you'll note that they are always portrayed as the exception that, get their comeuppance. They get found out, they get kicked off the force, they get ostracized. That's not actually what we see in the real world. And portrayals of corruption also are often not related to the types of corruption and the overzealousness of using force that we just see over and over and over again. Speaking of which, does have to be mentioned the recent case where law enforcement shot and killed a man they thought looked like a suspect that they were pursuing. This was someone who was not even the right guy and was not armed, but had lethal force used on him all the same. He had no chance to actually comply with any orders. Just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and law enforcement decided, that's our guy, let's kill him. Which again is not what law enforcement should be. Just had to mention that one. I also enjoyed watching the short-lived series Swat, the inspiration for the 2003 Samuel L. Jackson film of the same name, and syndicated episodes of Adam 12, both of which were set in Los Angeles. No more than 10 or 11 years at the time, I fancied myself as SWAT's Dominic Luca and rookie officer Jim Reed from Adam 12. Little did I know that the SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics Unit, had been designed in the mid-1960s by Los Angeles Police Department Inspector Daryl Gates in the aftermath of the Watts riots of 1965. I also didn't know that. He goes on about that. Intended as the police force's militarized arm that could address criminal situations that needed quick and potentially violent resolution, such as snipers and the taking of hostages, SWAT teams became a means to address urban protest. This warrants repeating. The stated goal, I just want to walk through this again. The stated goal, the purpose of establishing the SWAT force, was to have a militarized arm of domestic law enforcement that could address criminal situations that needed a quick and potentially violent resolution. Now, I want to really hammer home this. We arm our beat cops on the street to the teeth already. So we decided we needed an even more heavy-handed, more armed, more violent arm of law enforcement. Like, that by itself is crazy. And our justification for arming every cop is, well, what if a situation requires a quick and violent resolution? Like, this is the justification people actually give for why every cop needs a gun. We have a special unit explicitly for this. So if that's the explanation, beat cops should not have guns, period. Like if that's the purpose of SWAT. But the actual function of SWAT has nothing to do with that. SWAT, yeah, it has become used to disrupt large, protests movements. Not surprisingly, one of the first uses of SWAT was an attack on the Black Panthers LA headquarters in December 1969, in which more than 300 officers took on 13 Black Panther members, more than half of whom were women and children. The attack occurred only days after a similar police raid in Chicago that killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in what poet I cannot pronounce this, Matabuti, called a one-sided shootout. Both incidents highlight the close relationship between local law enforcement and the FBI in the period. So, SWAT, established to go into situations where there are snipers or hostages or, some extreme threat that will require the use of extreme violence as a response. And their primary uses of it were to drop 300 officers into the Black Panther Party's headquarters, where there were 13 members, half of them women and children, who were not fighting. I mean, they weren't doing anything. It was hitting the headquarters. And then going into Chicago and killing people. They're not there to make arrests. This is a unit explicitly designed to, they do make arrests, but they're designed to inflict violence, even more so than normal cops. And yet, there's a whole TV series, like he mentions, called SWAT, which does not actually do this. It does not portray that. It portrays SWAT as actually fulfilling its on-paper function, not its real-world application. Because if there was a TV series that showed the SWAT teams just busting in on 13 people, 7 or 8 being women and children, and taking a bunch of unarmed folks by force at a number of nearly 30 to 1, people might recognize that, hey, what the fuck? How is this, how is this reasonable at all? How is this not living in an extreme police state? But we do live in an extreme police state. Let's see. The show Adam 12 featured the Rampart division of the LAPD, which 2 decades after the show's debut would become the basis of a police corruption case involving the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums Crash Unit. Also conceived of by Gates, Crash intimately connected to the police brutality narratives heard in gangster rap of the late 1980s and 1990s in songs like Uddy T's Batteram and NWA's Fuck the Police. In the case of Crash, the narrative of urban radicals had shifted to the concerns about the war on drugs during an era when crack cocaine was being introduced to black and brown urban communities. Aside from the examples in rap music, most Americans were unaware of these efforts until the release of the 1988 film Colors, in which Robert Duvall and Sean Penn portrayed Crash officers. I have to admit, I was guilty of that, even though I grew up when the film Colors came out. It's not one that I watched. It's one that I should watch, I believe. the narrative about the war on drugs was also very, very insidious, and there's been more than a fair share of evidence that the pushing of crack cocaine was helped along quite a bit to get those cheaply into poor neighborhoods in order to, have a charge against people. The way that the war on drugs is framed, I mean, just the very term, paints drug users as a violent enemy that must be fought with violence. The very term is designed to conjure up a battle between us and them. And so, if you look at any of the war on drugs, like portrayals and such at the time, even Dare, its advertisements, as much good as Dare did, there were still issues with the fact that almost all of the time the portrayal of the person that needed help, the drug user, is always portrayed as a black or brown person, usually from like an urban neighborhood. And this constant reinforcement of this image and the constant reinforcement of war on drugs narrative does create in people's mind a justification for that violence. This Swat's Dominic Luca. Over here, Adam 12. Just a couple pictures of those shows. And these were kind of how cops were portrayed, for sure. Very clean cut, very good uniform, always doing the things by the book and such. The irony was that the affable Dominic Luca and Jim Reed of the shows SWAT and Adam 12 respectively were the public faces of the LAPD in an era in which its figureheads like Gates, who became the very symbol of racist policing in the post-civil rights era, were creating apparatuses that would have dramatic and traumatic effects or impacts on black communities for decades. These contradictory realities speak to how palpable propaganda was as a resource to influence public opinion and thus public policy regarding law enforcement. Yeah, because these shows came... let's see. Dare also propagated framing drug use as an issue of immorality rather than a weakness or self-destruct. Yeah. Not just immorality, but something that would be a clear and present threat to people other than the user. And yeah, that narrative is still being pushed now. Let's see. And yeah, what he's saying here, these shows, they were devised, right after some of the bigger civil rights protests and things, when law enforcement was in desperate need of an image makeover. And they got it through television, in large part. The timelines of these things is very important. A lot of these shows came around in the 70s, early 70s and such, and that is right after the civil rights riots and the civil rights movement kind of came to a close. And it's a lot of the civil rights movement was not, it wasn't just about, voting rights. A lot of it was also about what we're still seeing today. This law enforcement being used as a violent cudgel against, to keep non-white communities down, and economic policy being used to keep non-white communities down. So it is not really a wonder that Hollywood kind of circled the wagons around law enforcement, and I'm sure a lot of money went into it. Like was mentioned about that show, the FBI. In that one, the actual FBI vetted this series, and you can bet that they wanted to make sure their image was good, that their portrayals were positive. With the exception of the ensemble casts of the sitcom Barney Miller and the melodrama Hill Street Blues, black officers were largely missing as primary characters in the narratives of the 70s and 80s, a dearth that reflected the lack of diversity in station houses in the period. Charles Barnett's 1994 film The Glass Shield, for example, fictionalized a real-life attempt to integrate a Los Angeles area sheriff's office. Black novelists filled in the gaps, though. Esther Himes' Harlem Detectives series featured Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson, two detectives who became more prominent when they were depicted by Godfrey Cambridge and Raymond Jacques, respectively, in 1970's Ossie Davis directed film Cotton Comes Home to Harlem and Comeback Charleston Blue 2 years later. This, is unsurprising. People were still, it's unsurprising, but it's not really a good thing. People were still coming to terms with and angry about black people getting more rights in general. They would not have wanted to see a TV portrayal of a black police officer. That would be terrifying to, white nationalists, basically, to white supremacists. And as we see, that's a lot more people than we've wanted to admit. In Raymond Nelson's 1972 essay on Himes' detective novels, he describes Gravedigger and Coffin Ed as, let's go ahead and, of defiance, strength, and masculinity to a community that has been forced to learn, or at least to shame, weakness, and compliance. And indeed, on-screen Cambridge and St. Jacques' performances of the duo were given the gravitas of race men. These figures, often men within black life and culture who were committed to the race. They didn't simply acquiesce to the white power structure that employed them, but also offered a healthy skepticism of ghetto hustlers while using their badges and relative privilege to look out for the least of in Black Harlem. The extent to which Gravedigger and Coffin Ed were depicted as being embedded in the very fabric of Black Harlem was a refreshing counter to the drive-by treatments of black life found in most media in the era, particularly with regards to law enforcement. These films I also have not seen, but I do fully understand the point that's being made, which is most black cops in movies, in the 80s that I did see were caricatures. The fact that they were black was kind of just a shtick that was played off of, and black life in general was not at the heart of the film. It had no place. It was not portrayed. It was not really the focus. Race issues in general were avoided like they were the plague. Especially in the 80s, a lot of movies portraying cops were the buddy cop system. And in that one, you would have, like a lot of them, you would have a white primary protagonist and a black, less capable sidekick, who was really just a foil for the, kind of a comedic foil to play off of. Which does a great disservice and kind of shrugs off a lot of the issues that really warranted scrutiny. Of course, a lot of white media is about avoiding that scrutiny in the first place. From left, Danny Glover and Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon. The 1991 film A Rage in Harlem, a third of Himes' detective novels to be adapted for the big screen, found Gravedigger and Coffin Ed on the periphery. Oh, hold on. Isn't as bad with it, but an example that came from that. A lot of people probably know Lethal Weapon. Yeah, he ends up talking about that one. But yeah, that is very true. Found Gravedigger and Coffin Ed on the periphery of the film's focus, as if it were a metaphor for the cultural shifts that had seemingly occurred in the previous 2 decades. In many ways, Gravedigger and Coffin Ed were precursors to the black-white cop buddy films of the 1980s. Danny Glover and Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon, or 48 Hours, in which Eddie Murphy played a petty criminal working with a detective. Whereas the idea of cop buddy films with 2 black actors was not tenable with Hollywood at the time, and would not be until the Bad Boys franchise, the black-white cop buddy films were more marketable given the success of films like The Defiant Ones and the Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder films of the 1970s and 1980s. No, oops, like that's, the fact that you're thinking about that, you're definitely seeing the same things that he's laying out here. Notable about these films, including the Bad Boy franchise with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, is the way that black officers were largely evacuated from black life and community. Though Glover played a family man in Lethal Weapon, there was nothing inherently black about his life. In fact, Gibson played the role of the rogue cop. This could also be seen in the television series NYPD Blue, where James McDaniels portrayed Lieutenant Arthur Fancy for the series' first 8 seasons. Yet there was little attention to his life outside of the precinct. The Law & Order franchise reveals little about the backstory of numerous black officers portrayed by the likes of Jesse Martin, Anthony Anderson, and Ice-T, who has portrayed Sergeant Finn for nearly 20 years. This is true. If you look at, these black officers in these films, the life they lead is, it's largely a white life. They just happen to be black. They are absent from, they're largely absent from black neighborhoods. They do not have to deal with racial issues that exist. They largely are living in, houses or some sort of house situation where they are living kind of a more white life, where they have their job that they routinely go to. And I'm not saying these are unique white people, but there's some quality about the absence of... They exhibit the privilege of a white person in these films, despite being black. I'll phrase it that way. I think that's a fair way to say it. They are not discriminated against in the same ways that a real black person would be, and they do not have to navigate the difficulty of being a black officer in a system that is inherently anti-black. That never gets examined in these films. The aforementioned fictional officers exist in contrast to Boys in the Hood, Officer Coffee, a black cop whose disdain for black youth is palpable. Denzel Washington's Oscar-winning performance as Alonzo Harris in Training Day is yet another example of a character who is allowed to rain terror on a black community due to the faulty logic of black-on-black crime and the benign neglect directed towards poor and working-class communities of color that renders those communities as complicit in their own pathologies. In such instances, it seems blacks and others do not deserve to be protected and served. So yeah, these two films that he does mention, I'm very familiar with Training Day. They do seem to... They do approach law enforcement as a anti-black mechanism, but they flirt with justifying it. They largely portray those communities as deserving of it, and that, you know, black neighborhoods just are a breeding ground for violence and drugs and crime, and the hostility of law enforcement is warranted. It is a good contrast to point out, and I'm not sure when the turning point was, where for a long time officers simply were portrayed as benign, jokey, having fun while affecting good, and then shifting from them just being good and being friendly and, being there for the community, to this. Now, the first sets up in your mind that cops are good and largely harmless. The second style of film portrays cops who you already think of as good and harmless as justified in acting out. Jose does on YouTube. Yeah, I know Jose. I would be interested in seeing that series of videos on that. Yeah, if you could link those up, Chillin, that would be really a good watch and a good follow-up to this, I think. So if folks are in the Discord, if you're not, you should join it. But yeah. Give it a look. All good. All good. There's a lot of creators out there, which is good. We need more voices. But yeah, once you're thinking that cops just are a force for good, and then you see them acting out, and you see the people they're acting out against as portrayed as these pockets of just violent drug-using criminals, that flips a switch, and you will start thinking exactly this. That blacks and others, that people living in those neighborhoods do not deserve to be protected and served, that they must be subjugated. But the first step was softening the image and making people view cops as inherently their friend and inherently harmless. Neither of those things are true. That such characters were featured in films by black directors, John Singleton and Antoine Fuqua, respectively, doesn't change the fact that in much of popular culture, black officers are no longer race men at all, but rather stand-ins for the very anti-black violence directed at black communities. As a whole, these characters are complements to the purposes of propaganda, serving as examples of black exceptionalism on the one hand, while suggesting that policing is race neutral, but criminality is not. That is a very interesting phrasing, a very thoughtful phrasing. So, first of all, black exceptionalism. This goes back to this idea of, who are the good ones? And that's a terrible concept. It is a terrible concept. Because it starts from the premise of they are all bad ones except for... and then this whole notion of that policing is race neutral. Yeah, it does try and portray that. And I'm sure that those novels that he mentioned earlier on, with Coffin and such, that they had a more real portrayal, especially in trying to actually help out black neighborhoods. But that was, that was written by a black novelist, and it was moved into movies that it seems like the message was largely lost in the film portrayals. And I'll be the first to admit, and I, am ashamed of this, but as a white person, my non-white literacy has for a very long time been extremely limited. And, that is, it's not only a shame, but it actually affects some harm. We remain blinded to perspectives that are outside of what we consume, the information that we, and the perspectives that we allow ourselves to view and hear. And if, if these more realistic portrayals were largely isolated in black media, and it never really got the penetration into white media because we have a serious problem with that still, we're missing out on this sort of reality. Yet the more things change, the more they stay the same. Those beat cops on Adam 12 that I once idolized as a kid now sit comfortably around the Sunday dinner table as 3 generations of officers on the police drama Blue Bloods. Thoughtful, introspective, and devoted to God, family, and the law. Who wouldn't want them to protect and serve? An interesting way of ending that. Because, yeah, this is the typical portrayal of many cops. Like, think through a lot of the movies. They're very, very often portrayed as Christian. They have a family life. Sometimes it's, a struggling family life. But they're, devoted to a wife that is worried about them. And they have a dedication to actual justice. They are self-aware. They are very, careful about their interactions. That is a cop and a police drama in a nutshell. But that's not the typical cop. This part in particular is interesting. And admittedly, we do have, a majority of Christianity in the country. However, the fact that so many media portrayals of cops, especially more recent ones, does make such a point to deliberately and overtly highlight the cop protagonists' religious leanings tells you something about the audience that they are trying to reach to, and the attempt to correlate law enforcement itself with being moral and even pious. Now, the author doesn't really harp on this point, but I wanted to kind of stick with that tiny phrase at the end of his essay here a little bit longer, because that is very much something that I think it's exploited, and I do mean exploited. Religion is very often conjured to instantly demand sympathy from a certain segment of the population. Admittedly, I as an atheist am not affected when I see those sorts of portrayals, but in the minds of those who are, Christian, especially Protestant, when they see a character who is, overtly Christian, they will tend to be much more sympathetic to that character. And they will tend to view that character's actions as morally righteous, no matter what. It does blind them to other things. Because how can you be, devoted to God and still be immoral? It doesn't make sense. And that's not to say that, no Christian can critically think and such, but it is a shortcut to force sympathies where maybe they are undeserving. Now, we continue to have series after series after series of various law enforcement agencies, which works very aggressively to humanize them and portray them in a very positive light. This is unsurprising, but I do wonder about, it's obviously very, very effective, but I wonder why there isn't really a very good market for showing the reality. I mean, maybe it's too depressing. Maybe it's the predominantly white audience in America would reject it. I'm not sure. But I do know, Even shows that I kind of like what, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It tries to show cops as more progressive and humorous and doing good, and they don't really, no one's really grabbed it by the horns and actually dug into the injustice of police just laying it out there bare as a TV series and the struggle against that. I don't know what that movie would look like. I think A Few Bad Apples would be an interesting tongue-in-cheek title for it if I were to make it. Especially if the point you were trying to drive and the narrative that you were portraying was that it is all of them, not just a few of them. I'm asking about a movie or show that depicts cops in a more realistic light. Not just that they're violent, but that specifically their victims do not deserve it. There probably are movies and shows that depict it, but I am not, I don't watch enough movies. The Wire. Okay. I'll have to give that a watch. Give that a what? But yeah. That was The Myth of the Good Cop. And again, that was the 4th essay of 30 in the Abolition for the People series.